Сегодня мы говорим с Карлом Аймермахером,
Today
которому,
we're talking to Karl Eimermacher. Thank you, Karl, for this conversation. I've been hinting, I think, for quite some time at this conversation that it should take place.
рада, что он сейчас вот получается.
And I'm very happy that it's finally happening.
Собственно, я все регалии перечислять не буду, потому что тут дело
I will not list your full bios with all the titles and awards, because we are focused today not on the titles, but on the books that I should be actually listing one by one, and we should be discussing them. That's our plan for today. I wanted to say is that we're talking to the professor of Slavic Studies, director of the Institute of Russian and Slavic Literature, named after Lotman, at the Ruhr University in Bochum. He's a person who initiated and created lots of important things. Series of publications, particularly, which something that is very important for me personally, is the institute where I studied, while one of my institutes. It's the Institute of European Cultures in Moscow. And that's one of the potential topics for today's conversation. It's a running thread running since 1956 until 2004, or maybe even onwards. How was it possible to be in touch with Russia, with the Russian scholars, with the cultural figures and researchers? How one could get involved in those contacts and support them, and what was important for you to research back then. Hi, Karl. Thank you so much for being here. I, at the same time, am letting people in the room. And perhaps I should hit the brakes a little bit so that everyone can join us. But in any case, in the mailing list of our seminar, I sent a link to the interview with you on the portal called Get2RU. It's a full biographical interview with you. And let me start today with retelling this interview with your first memories of Russians, which probably were not most happy memories of yours, because it was first period after the Second World War. I was really impressed by your phrase that peaceful coexistence with the winners and losers was normal for us because it created the atmosphere of peace and tranquility. And a little bit higher than that, you were mostly impressed by the machine guns, Kalashnikovs probably, in the hands of the soldier. And then more on how the attitudes towards Russians were shifting in the German society, this dualistic attitude to Russian soldiers, to the Soviet soldiers. And then about the 17th of June of 1953, about the Soviet troops that fought the uprising, that put down the uprising. And all of that you shared in many details in the interview, and all those things that were impressive in your interview. So it brings about my first question: how could one decide to learn Russian back then? So studying Russian literature came from the desire to be the teacher of Russian language. So this is my question: how could one decide and opt for the Russian language back then? What were the expectations in 1956 when one had to make a decision, when you were deciding where to go to the university? And in the USSR, we had the Khrushchev. And so what were your expectations what were you thinking of your future potential employment and cooperation with Russia and so on? That's a very tough question for those who were not present in the atmosphere, who were not there when we were there in Eastern Berlin. I forgot to say the most important thing. Sorry for interrupting you. Karl, I forgot to say that Karl lived in Eastern Berlin, East Berlin, and then not just cross the border, but actually cross the border to learn to study at the Free University in Berlin. Yeah, and that is the background for the question that you were giving. Yes, you're right. In my so-called memoirs, I wrote that when for the first time I saw a Soviet soldier, when we came back from Bavaria to Berlin, there was lots of strange situations with those soldiers because in 46 we could still see them in the public space. They were either in groups or they were drunk in groups. That was a strange experience. But back then I already had some kind of I was emotionally drawn. I wanted to understand this Russian language. I want to study it. I want to understand and learn it as a native language. I couldn't achieve that result because in those times when I attended school, even from fifth grade, nobody actually wanted to deal with Russian because that was the language of the Soviets, everything Soviet. It's a reflection of everything Soviet that had very strong, absolutely negative connotations for us. But I still had this desire to learn the language. So I probably separated the emotional from the rational, the language from the Soviet, and I was never against it. And the general situation in terms of language was that way that in those times no one would have chosen that language to keep studying it at the university level. But in the end, that was my interest, and I applied for the Humboldt University. I was rejected. Why? I don't know. Maybe my knowledge of language was insufficient, but they didn't test me. They just saw the marks in my school diploma. And just that was the fact that I was rejected, so I decided to move to be able to study what I wanted. But Russian language as a profession, as a professional path in life, it happened because I applied for the second time for university in West Berlin, and I was surprisingly admitted. I was I attended the translation of the report of Khrushchev in Berlin, and I was listening to it, and I hoped that, okay, now relations between our countries will be better. And then for this improvement, we need teachers of Russian, and that was a decisive factor for me. So I was admitted to the university, and I had the Slavic studies as a subject. And within that course, it became possible. It was possible to focus on the Russian language studies. What kind of Slavic studies? I was a very innocent young person. I've never had any contact with universities or people who would explain to me what to do, what not to do, what the lectures look like, and seminars and so on. So I was just thinking, okay, I need to attend a lecture. Okay, Professor Breuer's professor, whom I've grown to respect a lot. That was a subject called comparative linguistics within Slavic studies. But he didn't start with the ancient area of the Russian language, but he started with the ancient Indian, Lithuanian, Polish. He was just going into the comparative studying of those ancient roots of modern languages. And I was in horror. I wanted to leave the lecture. Then the second time I wanted to be, when I started studying to become a teacher of Russian. I went to the course on translation from German to Russian. There was an assistant professor, a very respectable person from former Petersburg, and he said, I decided that this year we will be translating novel by Thomas Mann, Buddenbrook. And his claim was that this novel was intranslatable. Later on, I came to know that it was possible, but so we will then. He continued with going for a translation of Immanuel Kant's Critic of Pure Mind, and was a disaster because of very complicated syntaxes and everything. And there were scarcely enough copies of the book, and we had a printouts from the typing machine and typewriter. So the texts were hardly accessible for us. And of course, even harder was to translate for any of us. So I continued. I had to add to my Russian education, studying outside of the university walls. And what about other courses, non based on the language? Yeah, there were also history courses, something else. Yeah, this was the basis, was the foundation. The level was very poor, not sufficient for the future scholarship. Max Fassma, a famous who wrote the only existing etymological Fassmer, who wrote the only existing etymological dictionary. Yes, it was there. So, what were the cultural context and influences? That was not sufficient. We didn't have proper literary studies. So the first one Yuri Steger was the first one who discovered, and being a German scholar, German language scholar, he was open to bring us into the Russian literature from the point of view of the Germanist, from the point of view of German literature scholar, and it was something else that was very, very important for us. We had a seminar on the Soviet literature. On the 12th, by block, I wrote a small paper at student level on Gladkov's Concrete. But that was part of the official line. Nothing else was possible. But it was still very poor, besides the lectures of Steter, who became later on my supervisor in my academic work. I was focused on the linguistic studies and not literary studies initially. And while he himself, he didn't have anyone to offer a job in his team, he offered it to me. I was doubtful, but there were no other opportunities, no other offers, and that's how in order to defend my doctoral thesis, I also had to work with Czech and Serbian, Croatian, and ancient Greek and Latin, something I never foresaw. But he offered me to a referate. That was what it was, not even an assistant's job. It was something else, and something that was not even existing anywhere else. It was on the Soviet Studies department. It was Soviet Studies. It was a subject that could actually mean that you could raise funds for that position. I was not required to focus on the Cold War issues. I was able to pursue my own interests, and those were the early years of what later on became to be the center of interest of Konstanz University. But the traditional limitations of Slavic studies and the distinction from the German studies or English studies, it did exist. We were separated, and we had a very small circle who we were all interconnected, and we discussed any question that was also not related with German or English studies, but we more focused on the issues of methodology. I was lucky that I through the literature encyclopedia, I stumbled upon the notion of structuralism. It was very interesting for me.
It was very interesting to me because at the time we were discussing French structuralism and not much else. That's how I got into Lotman's University. And my aim was to gather the literature of this circle that was named the Moscow Tartu School. Back at that time, nobody knew who these people were or what they were writing about. And I decided to put together a huge bibliography. It was a real challenge because there were these articles and reports of various articles at different conferences, and they were not presented in Soviet bibliographies. They had fewer than 500 citations. And I can show you what it looked like. So I think you can see on my screen. This is a rarity. What year is it from? This is 1974. Quite a long time ago. In connection with this, because I subdivided the literature not only by name, but also by subject, I had to have it all handy to read it all so that the representatives of this Tartu circle would be represented. And I saw that the idea of culture is much greater and much broader than I had imagined, than I would have known if I had just stuck to Slavic studies. When I was in the Slavic Institute in Berlin, and Papa Osman, so the idea of culture, your broadened understanding of this concept, how is it connected to what Lotman is doing? And this kind of contradiction between culture and power, this juxtaposition. It is a very clear juxtaposition because this is one that I grew up with. By the same token, the question remains, so it's clear where it comes from. So we have these collections of articles. This is dated 2001. the juxtaposition of culture and power. How were you with it? How were your colleagues, your students over the past few decades? The thing is, I was talking about where I came from, and I talked about my studies of linguistics and literary studies. So these were my first years at the Free University. In my further development in my work in Constance University, we studied Russian formalism. I studied structuralism and semiotics, but as it turned out, the roots of what we would later come to call culture in general, we can trace the roots back to the 20s. So the formalists is kind of one breed, but what the most important figure for Lotman included is Tunyan. From the point of view of linguistics, that's Roman Jacobson. They wrote certain thesis statements regarding the studies of literature and language. They talked about a system of signs. It was not very clear-cut, but Tunyan said that when we look at the literary process as a cultural process, we have to look at certain variants within culture. We need to look at the language, we need to look at art, we need to look at music. And if we study one of these branches separately, if we look at the structure of each of these strands, then you are acting as a scientist, as a scholar. You can conduct a systematic study. So in the 60s and the 70s, when we look at this phenomenon, we realize that culture is not fragmentary. Culture is not simply art and paintings. And when we look at the development of cybernetics and mathematics and art and language and literature, this is the 1950s, the semiotic approach. Anything that is connected to a sign or a phenomenon, then it is a reflection of culture. And this is, of course, separate from non-culture. As for culture and power, it is clear that if you study culture, if you study cultural processes, then in the countries where art and culture and life is regulated from the top down, and when things that don't fit the main discourse are excluded, then of course we're talking about the juxtaposition of culture and power, and this is a topic that interested me greatly. And when we think of the 50s and the tones that you held up to the camera, back then I was definitely interested in we knew about the development of cultural policy, about culture and power. But from the standpoint of methodology, I wanted to understand whether what we are describing around these published texts, whether this corresponds to the processes that are happening kind of backstage. So what did what was happening behind the scenes match what was being published openly? And so we got to going through the archives, and we discovered that these kind of mainstream lines did not change. And it's only natural because those in power who want to push a certain agenda, they need to publish this in one way or another, whether it's hidden, whether it's indirect, whether it's direct. There are different ways of conveying information. That is why dissidents, just as all of the scholars, just as all the scholars from other countries, had access to these materials. And they had to study it in order to find changes, whether they were mainstream or hidden on the margins. And this all ties into the juxtaposition of culture and power. In Germany today, for instance, we cannot look at public life without this juxtaposition. And not only is it not possible, I don't think we should. Because regardless of the rules that are in place, of the laws that we have in place, this juxtaposition has existed and will exist. This binary is somewhat of a constant. And of course, cultural life is not usually discussed in relation to this juxtaposition. Nonetheless, it exists. There are a couple more juxtapositions that we can talk about. So this book, Soviet Literary Policy of 1930, in the 1930s, from diversity to the Bolshevization of literature. And another book of Dirk Kretschmer, Soviet Cultural Policies of 1970-1985, From Controlled to Self-Governed Culture. So how did people imagine this? It's also a kind of binary. What about this book then? It's about how all of these vibrant, unstructured,
This is
a quote from Gogol. So what is this path? Can we compare it to a cultural boom?
Нет, я не сравнивал бы. Взрыв
I wouldn't compare this with an explosion, because an explosion is something, is a very strong movement. There were no explosions I observed, except for the glasnost phenomenon, when suddenly things resurfaced that before that had existed, but hadn't been public, or least public. When you ask questions of how this went together in the in the 20s and the 70s, we meant we meant the control in the 20s, control of the authorities. You could observe it everywhere, on every step, from partial to full guidance and control. There, of course, existed the circles and writers and people who managed to continue working without much control. But the question that interests me is, how can you explain the emergence of cybernetics and new linguistics in the 50s in Russia? I was told that the people who just observing what happened outside of the Soviet Union. So they didn't reinvent something, they were continuing that others had been doing. They just needed to strengthen your own. You had to reinforce your own work. Even now, there was always the opposition between the power and culture, but it was much more complicated than that, because outside of the authorities, there was still a lot of culture happening outside of the control of the authorities, like today. So, but it is just one example. Just one example of the diversity of going from monolithic towards diverse landscape towards the mid-70s. You could, in the public, there appeared things that had always been there, but now they resurfaced, but they found its way into the printed form. And we started monitoring those. Literary Moscow 1 and 2 with some text. We followed what happened around the Novi Mir magazine. On one hand, it turned out that there is a state control, it exists, it's active, they can be very harsh in their activities, but at the same time, from below, from bottom up, things happen things that are needed in the mass conscience, mass awareness. And whether you want it or not, they find their way to the surface. For example, after a publication of Solzhenitsyn's One Day of Ivan Denisovich, there suddenly came into being a huge number of texts of a similar spirit. The authorities were appalled, they were shocked, and they said, stop, don't publish so much. They didn't block it altogether, but so in order not to have the explosion, he needed to extinguish the fire. But anyways, since there wasn't energy enough for an explosion, the fire continued. And in the 70s, you can prove it with the documents. You can also see that for example, in relation to the visual arts, there were exhibitions, home-based exhibitions, but also in some cultural spaces. They were possible, but they were instantaneously shut down by the KGB. But after 1973, the KGB changed its patterns. For some time, they allowed the public to those exhibitions, and then they shut it down. So it was a dilution of sorts, and kind of the power structures from the mid-70s. So you can, of course, oppose the in the 20s and the further decades. Then I immediately have a lot of questions.
Культурный взрыв. Я имел в виду Лотмана.
By cultural explosion, I meant Lotman. I meant this movement that in theory happens in Tartu. Can you see something parallel here with a binary opposition and then the attention towards the explosion to something that doesn't fit into the binary opposition? My other question is about the authorities and the power. Why are you using the word power and not the word state? I'm having this question because I've been reading Grossman, and he has this subject, state, and it's a subject. And my third question is the transition from those studies of structures towards the studying of the informal culture, of unofficial culture, nonconformism, or maybe word choice is also essential here. And perhaps how these studies and this research changes these oppositions between power of state and culture. I doubt that this research had any impact. Let's get back to Lotman. Before him writing the book, we met in Berlin first. Steg invited him to the Academy of Science, to GDR, and since we were friends, we met Lotman, and I asked him a question. How do you think, under what conditions can something change? It was either late 70s or probably even early 80s. And he said, I doubt anything changes. There are no preconditions for that. There have to be specific conditions and some factors, and these factors have to align, and then happens the explosion. And he said he couldn't foresee any of such explosive change. He could have used the argument of Einers saying when he spoke about the German Peasants' War, such turn of an uprising of peasants is only possible when there's an alignment of specific terms and factors, and that there's a leader. If there's no leader, like, for example, today there is a position in Russia, but there is no leader because he was killed. So the preconditions for explosions are there, but there is no explosion. So that's as much as Lotman goes. And the research we made, or other studies. But their impact, well, it depends on what kind of studies that were, if they're systematic. Well, our volumes were not so much of research, they were publications of documents, nothing else. Why documents? Why did I come up with this series? Because I realized during Perestroika that there's a lot of material in different newspapers, magazines. They wanted to increase the numbers of publications and they participate in the Perestroika process. But there were no consequences to these drastic publications, no court for legal proceedings. So the publications as such did not cause any repercussions. And since there were a lot things published happening based on factual material that no one actually managed to check. So what I said is that we will publish these documents in order to at least have a layer of a material to reference, to be able to refer to. But we were not researchers. For example, our research in Bochum, the volumes of Esmir and others, no one read it. Maybe now, in post factum, there is a growing interest how the situation looked like in the 50s, or because we're interested in what really happened back then, of course. And it's important for the cultural process. What is there an impact? Is there an influence from the research towards the real events? We may hope, but we can't expect them to happen. But of course, for the cultural processes, we need these works studying this impact. So as those works are important for culture because we may be able to refer to such works and go beyond and counter any kind of demagogy. Nikolai Plotnikov, please. Thank you. I just wanted to add a small comment to what Karl said, that Bochum research was never read and had no impact. I will disagree with that because that's actually my question, my topic, because it was not just studying of unofficial art. That was an attempt to popularize that art in the West somehow, to organize an exhibitions, to have some literary readings in the evenings around this unofficial art. And this kind of work, this organizational work around unofficial art, not just studies, but more of publicity, more of promotion, creating a platform and a forum to develop that art. I believe that it's worth discussing, and it would be important for us to hear your take on this, Karl, especially because we always encounter this. Whenever you read Sorokin, for example, you suddenly find some memories of some Bochum front he mentions in Tellurian. So there is some kind of cultural environment which now is almost gone into oblivion or into the history books, but the witnesses are still alive, witnesses of these processes, and it would be important to mention this. Yes, I don't object. I have nothing per principle kind of objections to this. And maybe it's not enough to say they had no impact. I meant it didn't impact the process in Russia itself. A separate issue is who discovered the eyes of the West towards this diverse, these phenomena in the art sphere in Soviet Union, and not just art, but maybe art and literature. I suddenly had students following me who went, for example, to study for a year in Russia, in Moscow, and they collected more documents, and that actually meant a lot for the artists there locally, because when they were at home and they just had a conversations, discussions between themselves, and suddenly they have they become popular, some exhibition in the West. For them, that made a double meaning. In one way, that was a measure of protection, so that the state secret services would not attack them so strongly. Now, they would have been able to do that, of course, but that offered them some kind of protection. And on the other hand, they realized that there are people who respect what they've been doing and want to promote what do I do to Sigur. And that was important emotionally and practically.
As you talked about the Bochum aspect, this is a kind of myth, I think. I think this was done to increase the kind of authority. You may blame me for doing the same. Nonetheless, what I said about the meaning of it for those people whom I've mentioned, in fact, I believe that the quote-unquote Bochum activities is not limited to those who were literally from Bochum. These are some Berlin-based artists who were part of this movement. What I said about Slavic studies at the end of the 1950s and beginning of the 1960s, this was very different to what we are dealing with in the past 20, 30 years, because these are new generations. As for contemporary literature, Frieda, who conducted seminars, and students such as myself, and not just us, also in Berlin, for instance, at the beginning of the 1970s, even left-wing communist and Maoist circles were discussing why they were not able to, why the revolution in Russia was not a success. So the groups started thinking about how we're coming back to proletarian culture. We're going to Slavistics and all of those people and trying to figure out why this was destroyed, why this concept did not work. This was a conversation held in the 1970s, at the very beginning of that decade. So there are many different sources, not just us, not just Bochum groups. Slavic studies have changed. There were others, such as Schlugel, who were extremely left-wing students, young scholars who started their work in such circles in Berlin. Of course, this was post-1968. This has changed. Unfortunately, this was not able to happen elsewhere because it was very much controlled. So culture and power is something that was very much alive. Thank you for your question. And I think we need to clarify what ASPI is. because I think it is not a very clear concept to many. It's an area in Bochum next to the university where Karl used to live.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Еще вопросы?
Any other questions?
Возражения?
Contradictions?
Тогда... Да, пожалуйста, Аня.
Anna?
Добрый день. А у меня вот,
Good day.
если вернуться к годам вашей
Coming
учебы,
back to the years of your study at the Freie
что
University,
стену поставили
it seems that the wall was put up
вашей учебы.
while you were studying.
Вот вы помните, насколько она плотно отгородила
Do you remember how
этих
much it separated the two universities and the two academic kind of circles and spaces? Kind of how permeable was this wall?
ваши по этому поводу воспоминания тогдашние?
What memories do you have of it? This is a really interesting question. We were very much separate, but some contacts did remain. I felt it firsthand at the moment when it was built, when it was closed off. I wanted to kind of rescue my brother from the eastern part, and this is when it was shut off for real. The thing is that 1 week later, West Berliners were banned from East Berlin. And that's why people in the FRG were able to pay a hefty sum of money to get a visa. Of course, there were ways around it. For instance, my mother lived in West Germany, and through her, I was able to get this passport, and I was able to freely move there and back, although it was expensive. That's one side of it. On the other hand, we were able to be in correspondence. For instance, I knew about Klaus Steke. He told me about Tartu, about Lotman, and we were in correspondence. I visited him. So such contacts, we always had them with people in other regions. Of course, we could only visit, only one party could visit the other, not vice versa. So we had contacts in the field of the fine arts with people who were not officially exhibiting their art. And yet there were people who wanted to know, why are these people different? And this was not a kind of revolt. I was just curious. I was just curious about this development within this dictatorship. So I was just curious about this relationship back then. Of course, from the side of the Soviet Union, we were accused of being kind of agents of some special services. That we are trying to kind of break up this country. And this was not really a thing among scholars. And although he was able to study he was able to do Soviet studies. You cannot say that this person represents the Soviet Union. University professors have an autonomous status. I remember that a professor from our university criticized our ministry. And I was actually appointed as a curator for this interaction between the ministry and the university. Of course, it was not easy. So this is a kind of anecdotal fact in response to your question. All countries want to receive funding from UNESCO in order to conduct cultural activities and events. And in East Berlin, the ex-director of this university, where Olga Rosenblum now is, he came up with an event about the input of Russian culture into world culture. And the condition from the side of UNESCO was that they should invite scholars from West Germany as well, so that the government would have the right to kind of fund this. And they turned to me. They agreed, but at the same time, the HR person had close ties in Moscow with the Institute of World Literature. And when he came back, he said, well, it's difficult to do this with Eimermacher. Let's find somebody else. So they found a different professor from Tübingen. Dlaka from Yugoslavia. It's hard to name all of the surnames. They were from GDR. So with me, there was this HR person who had to listen to what I was saying and report on what I was saying. So it was possible. So the director of the institute at the time, the CFL, invited me to take part in it. And she said, during this conference, everyone was given 2 books. And in the evening, I opened them. One of them is a pamphlet against me, several pages. And the guy said, well, don't worry, nobody reads these anyway. And he offered me to take part in the publication from the university. So they invited me to write about Turgenev. And the guy said, well, there'll be one publication, then another. He was probably chosen to come into contact with me so that eventually I would be silenced. But I simply said what I thought. So this was challenging, not very great relationships. So after coming together, and I don't know whether this was by chance or not, I was asked to take part. They were trying to see who was able to go, who was able to stay. So they were reporting to Moscow, saying that I was like a general. That I'm trying to kind of kind of clear out all of these Eastern universities. Franziska could not join us today, unfortunately. She recalls how we started this contact. It was all right at the beginning. We did not demand anything from them.
Есть два еще вопроса.
We've got two more questions. Nikolai, are you here? Yes, I am. And then Alexander Daniel. Thank you, Olga. My question relates to the research in Russian culture and even on the name of the institute, Lotman Institute of Russian and Soviet Culture. This sounds programmatic, like this sounds like a statement. Because the general line of researching in Slavic studies looked at the Russian culture as a global concept, global phenomenon, part of which was the Soviet culture as a stage, as a part and form of the existence of Russian culture, so Soviet literature as a part of Russian culture. But here in the name of the Institute of Russian and Soviet Culture, I hear a sort of opposition, and I assume it's conscious. So I wanted to ask you, given today's debates on the role of Russian culture, its understanding and its role, what was the impulse, what was behind the decision to give the name of the institute of being Institute of Russian and Soviet Culture? Initially, that was just the name that I put forward, and I still insist on it. Though, when I left the institute, it was renamed and the word Soviet when it was taken out. But very early, when we were coming up with a name, and the rectorate asked me, why do you need the word Soviet? And I said, well, Roman culture, there's no ancient Rome, but we can study the Roman culture nevertheless, even though Rome is there no more as a state. So I think there is a kind of opposition between the culture Soviet and Russian, or Russo-Soviet. I think in general it's not that essential, but I just don't want to exclude a huge the influence of the things Soviet onto the Russian culture, and that was my logic and behind the naming. What happened after me? That's already not my doing. I'm not behind this. Let them be responsible for that. If that's just a tiny detail or if it's essential. The most important thing is that the institute still exists. Yes, sure, of course. But if we look at Lotman, who himself never spoke of Soviet culture, or Likhachev, who always underlined, he spoke consciously about the Russian culture and avoided using the concept of Soviet, to Solzhenitsyn, who calls the concept of Soviet culture a false concept and ideological concept. So it's not just an array of things one by one. But for me, it sounds like a conscious opposition between the Russian culture to the Soviet culture in whatever form. So that's why I had this. I had the question about the role, because it's also named after Lotman. Well, I can add to this example. In the 70s, I visited a famous linguist, Revzin. I visited him at his place, and we had some business to discuss. And then he asked me, "How are you feeling here?" And I said, "Disgusting," meaning the Soviet. but he corrected me. I meant Russia. So that's just an example. There is an opposition. There is this distinction on the mental level. There was an opposition. Sidur. He said, "I'm not Soviet. I'm just an artist, and I'm not Russian. I'm Ukrainian." So, and it's a very relevant question today. From Dnipro, from Ukraine, they wanted. I said, I was given an order for saving Sidur for Ukraine, but I wasn't saving Sidur from Ukraine. For me, he's not Ukrainian, he's not Soviet, he's not Russian, he's European. We need to realize that we are more free, and we need to be able to do what we objectively want. That's an important point here. I will interrupt precisely at this point for us to remember this point. Alexander Daniel, please. Relating to what has just been said, I would say, first of all, European, and second, Moscow. Okay, I agree. He really loved Moscow. He always said, "Oh, I need to say, I love Moscow." Yes, of course, he loved Moscow. But this is emotional attitude. It's one thing. I would say he's not Russian or Ukrainian, but European and Muscovite. But sorry, my main point was a question. Was there an impact, and if so, what was the impact on the concepts and the understanding of German Slavic studies about the Russian and Soviets unofficial culture? Was it influenced by the emergence of a third wave of immigration and the emergence of new cultural centers? I understand. No, I would say no. No figure who'd create something common and something that would influence me, for example. Initially, I thought that, for example, my professor Streeter was my main influence and gave me interest in literature. But actually, my main teachers were Lotman, Ivanov, and Toporov, and Revzin, Pitigorsky. So these are my key figures. And no difference where Pitigorsky lives or is published. There's no difference in the Soviet Union or in the West, independently from where he lives. Yes. Of course. First well-known conversation with discussion with Mamardashvili on the sign systems. But then when we met at Ouspensky's place in Moscow, and then when he left, he made his way, of course, to Oxford, but we immediately invited him to Constance. We were closely connected, we were all friends. And we started writing on prolegomena on semiotics, which was never finished. In a way, but what was his role and what his impact? Since he was a Buddhologist, a Buddhism scholar, we discussed the question of conscience and the emergence of sign. Is there consciousness without science, or it's always connected to science?
Рецептам, значит, таких видных ученых, как Иванов и так далее. Ну, у них рецептов нет. Просто
And
когда мы в Москве, значит, познакомились, мы долго ждали.
there were no recipes of Ivanov or others. When we met in Moscow, we just wanted to spend some time. He was late, and his first phrase was, "I'm against structuralism in semiotics." It was his first phrase. And he was friendly, but still immediately imposed opposition. And we were always laughing and lightheartedly, we were discussing questions of philosophy, Buddhism, semiotics. So the general atmosphere was the basis for the emergence of new ideas, to be careful about what we discuss and what we speak about. So the question of relativity of that was the main concern. So the semiotic approach, even now under the influence of new linguistics, it's still an open question, always a question, always in progress. And so did they influence me? Unlike the dissidents generation, because the dissidents discuss their own problems. What I was always confused about, they pretended that being in the West, they need to enlighten the Western readers of what the essence of Russia or the Soviet Union is. It was there was something wild for me. And the others who left, we discussed things. We discussed the Russian situation, and the fact that they were outside of Russia, it never played a role. It was not important. There was no any opposition. If you are an interesting scholar, then we would have something to talk about with any kind of scholar. Thank you. Yeah, I more or less expected that. And I didn't expect this, says Olga, and I'm very grateful for this question. Yeah, interesting why this question came. Are there any other questions or comments? Then maybe I will ask a question. Our next session on the 5th of July is with Georg Witte, with Karl's students, about Lev Rubinstein and about conceptualists in general, and how with Sabine Hansen they translated not just texts from Russian to German, but also they translated as interpreted, as explained. They discovered for the readers in Germany the conceptualist. I have this volume here. We will be talking about this volume on the 5th of July. So my question was, what changed with the trip to Moscow in 1970? When you met Sidur? Yes, that's when you met him, yes. And what happened, what changed for your research, for your scholarly endeavors? Something and I forgot to ask a question about these series. the key publication series for Slavic studies and Soviet studies. What's all these diverse, beautiful, wonderful publications. Also this one, Russia, where are you running towards to? Yeah, that was a quote from Gogol again. And institutions of management of culture in which is not Gogol, from Stalin to Gorbachev. The same series here on the culture and culture and power from Stalin to Gorbachev. Very important, very necessary publications. And also these, this is in series Aaron Bloom, the censorship in the USSR. Maybe you can say a few words about this series. How did it emerge? How was it created? What is important and interesting in putting it together, and what wasn't? I heard that this book was hard to publish about the censorship. Is the question to me? I didn't get the question. This series on the documents and the Russian source culture about this series of publications. What other series were there, and what was interesting, what was not interesting? If I understood correctly, this particular book of Bloom was hard to publish. There were difficulties with it.
In Russia, this book was difficult to publish. I have always been interested in censorship because there was little information. The first articles appeared in England. These were just individual cases about incidents of censorship, but the entire book, like an overview, there was no such thing. And the first attempt to put this together, a book about censorship after the war, this was, and the editor Bareva, who got together various articles, and it was fascinating to learn about the fact that this was all getting together after the Soviet army was in Poland. Shortly after that, some KGB agents took the power. And this is something that happened all over the place. And this collection of articles shows this very vividly. In connection to these contexts, I discovered Bloom. I called him in St. Petersburg and discovered that he had a ready-made manuscript that no publisher would accept. And because these publishers liked some easy money to publish something in huge numbers. But how many people were actually interested in censorship and what was banned, what was not, what were the arguments? Such a book did not arouse such interest, such great interest. And I told him, I can give you 2,000 marks. Take this money for yourself and try to publish it, or give it to the publishers and just tell them that, you know, I don't care what you do as long as the book appears on the market. And that's exactly what happened. We invited them to Bochum. He continued his work. He was working in this library that was closed for like 40 odd years. In this library, he found certain arguments as to why they were not allowed in public libraries. And there were some strange things he discovered. That those who were making these decisions were completely ignorant. And that's why they made all of these terrible decisions. And what was interesting that Bloom discovered this, and he put together this collection, and it was actually published in Russia. So the question of power and authority was not primary. It was mostly demand of the market or lack thereof. Because the conditions of the publishers was that it had to be somewhat interesting and simply marketable. But you can see that if there is a series, then there is interest. It's well, having a series sounds more profound, sounds better. And that's why we decided to start this series. The question of who is financing it is always in the foreground. I don't even remember all of the details. Just like with all scholarly publications, it is always an issue. And I'm sure Nikolai understands this very well. Thank you very much. I would also like to add about the University of Bremen. It is clear that the initiative of this university came from Karl Eichwede. Our employees later became employees at Bremen University. And as a historian, as a scholar of political sciences, he was studying the dissident movement, including writers, including artists. But we took a different approach towards culture, although there are so many intersections. I'm glad that at a personal level, we helped each other. We were very much interconnected. That's all I wanted to say, just to make this clearer. All of these initiatives in Bochum, in Bremen, these are like personal initiatives rather than state initiatives. Unlike you know what. Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Что-нибудь тогда самое важное, Карл, или все уже самое важное?
Do you want to say the most important thing, or have you already mentioned all the important things? We have just a few more minutes left before we close for today. In our conversations, we touched upon the beginning and the beginnings of the dissident movement and interest in it. And this is no coincidence. I think it's connected to the fact that journalists, as a result of certain processes, started talking about it. And that's when society became interested in this as well. And on the part of the government, this interest may be due to the Cold War. In 1949, the journal Ostproblem was founded. And this has to do not only with Russia, but with the whole Eastern Bloc. The journal Osteuropa was not focused only on Russian issues. So the journal was published just as in the 1920s, they were analyzing these messages, analyzing these issues, publishing extracts from scholarly and non-scholarly journals and newspapers. And the journal Ostproblem was free of charge. I received it by chance because somebody found out that I was dealing in Russian and Soviet studies. And its content were not only around literature, but other issues as well. It was a conversation about a concept of pedagogy and astrophysics, something around Einstein, his theory of relativity. Sakharov, Ginsburg, and others kept working with scholars like Einstein. And Ostproblem stopped being published in 1960. These translations were of great interest to me because within this journal, there was a rubric called The Archive. And this was an attempt to keep something of the old Ostproblem. This is just something I wanted to add. Nikolai? Please put your microphone on. Because this is the closing, I have one final question that is connected to today. Right now, we are in a situation where Russia is turning into North Korea. According to your experience and your impression, how can we use this experience of looking into and being in contact with colleagues from Russia during the Cold War? Or is it something completely different? Let's say regarding accessing archives, taking part in conferences. Is this something we are reliving? Is this a return to a period that you started your research with, or is it something different from your point of view, if you compare these two epochs? Thank you. That's just like as a closing statement.
Yes, sure. That's a question that is important to me, that I'm concerned with that question. My contacts with the scholars continue. We are in touch, but we can't openly discuss their situation or anything else.
Исключены, значит, любые, значит, конференции или такие публикации и так далее.
So any kind of joint conferences or publications are out of question. We can push something forward, but in my case, I'm of an respectable age, and I will not be writing new books. But on the other hand, some of them are outside of the country, and that's a different situation. And I receive very clear picture of what's going on in the academy's apparatus, and what is demanded, required, what is possible, what is impossible, what is allowed, even though it's prohibited, and people sabotaging the orders. It does remind me of the previous ages, and it's scary. But yes, emotionally, the empathy towards them and the hope and understanding that people continue living without air, that they can't continue, and the explosion, I think, is coming, is on the horizon. It's being prepared. If the war with Ukraine ends, there might be another war happening. But the fact that there is an external war, then there's no explosion and no domestic internal war. But those who follow the course of events, we don't have the clear statistics, but it's clear that the current situation is an agony state, and the explosion is to be expected at some point. How long till that explosion? No, it's not known, but no country can keep existing in such situation. No conferences, scientific, no cooperation. I don't know what is still possible, maybe in astrophysics or in a space exploration, but maybe even not there, I'm not sure. But it's all so shut down, cut off from the international scientific processes, that this is it's not feasible in the long term. And if they, at the same time, they enforce and strengthen the military production, this all is not just feasible in the long run. Thank you for your question. Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Thank you. Thank you to Karl Eimermacher, to everyone attending, and those who asked questions. Our last session, our last seminar this semester will be on the 5th of July with Georg Witte, and in December we talk with Benjamin Natis with his new book that was not ready for this semester, but will be published very, very soon. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you to everyone. I was happy to see you.